dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I continue to be Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have in the studio with us today Liberty Nation's national security correspondent, Mr. Dave Patterson. Dave, thanks for coming back. It seems that each week we have to drag you in because there's some geopolitical issue taking place. And I guess the one that we really want to talk about this week is Iran.
Yes, it's there. Yes, suddenly Iran is, front page above the fold, and but it's very interesting that unlike the previous 2022 uprising, which was over women's rights, this one has an economic context to it, and you might remember that the green spring in in the north of Africa also was about economics. And the toppling of Egypt's leader was about economics. The price of bread and milk and staples had gone so high that nobody could afford them. And the same thing is happening in Iran.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, as you say, 2019, there was protest over women's rights. Now, Iran, since 1979, has not really been the bastion of anybody's rights. Let alone women, for that matter. And so the idea that some cultural or moral issue might lead to a downfall, it's kind of unthinkable, really. But when it comes to, I can't eat, I can't eat because what the government's doing is making a loaf of bread too expensive for me. I mean, that's an impetus there.
Absolutely. And it's, the rial, which is the currency, is now about 1.4 million to the dollar. And so the inflation rate is just horrendous. And that's the
about
problem.
40%, I believe. About 40%.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, for anybody who's wanting to put millionaire on their profile, just go and buy a couple of bucks worth of reals. You could then rightly claim I'm a millionaire in certain currencies. So we're recording this early in the week, Dave. And so things might change between now and when the show airs this weekend. But what do you think the governmental reaction in Iran is at the moment? Because it's a government that's used to protest, and it's always been very heavy-handed in shutting those down. Do they think this time is different?
I think they do, and because of the heavy-handedness with which they've dealt with the protesters. I mean, the number of protesters killed, varies depending on who you talk to, and the human rights advocates say between 500 and 544 of the protesters have been killed. That number is much inflated when you talk to protesters on the ground. They maintain that it's closer to 3,000, with 114 of the security forces having been killed as well. And so it's a big deal. I mean, it's not just this little uprising, and it's, even though in the past, when there's been significant protests, I mean, even when there was the peak of 1 million back under Obama, there has not been this level of violence against the protesters. And you know that it's that the government is concerned. I mean, they've basically blacked out all internet, and even the landlines they have cut.
Right. So that actually ties in with the amount of casualties being reported, I think, because obviously there's always the fog of war situation where people don't know exactly how many casualties there have been, how many deaths there have been. But there's also a political game for each side of this set to. I think set to is understating it, of course. But it behooves the Iranian government to keep that number of protesters as low as killed protesters as low as possible, and it behooves the people who are trying to ramp up international support for their cause and their protest to inflate those numbers as much as possible. And we actually saw that. I mean, we see that in almost every conflict, didn't we? We saw that in Gaza,
Yes.
where it's funny, isn't it? Because the figures that were coming out from the Palestinian side were the ones that were treated as gospel by much of the world's media, who were more sympathetic to Palestine, and the numbers that were coming out from the Israeli government, they were frowned upon. Looked at, well, you can't trust them because they're off killing all these people, whereas you know that.
Yeah, you can trust Hamas because they're
Sure, yeah, because those are the nice guys, right?
Right.
And of course, we've seen a similar thing in Ukraine and Russia too, where each side's trying to minimize their own losses and escalate the amount of casualties they've caused. And so, shutting down the internet, disrupting landline service as well. That's a way of ensuring only the dominant narrative escapes, I think. But back to how the Iranian government feels about this, I think this is notably more different because for now it seems that the merchants are against the government. And I'm sure some of our readers know about this. Maybe our listeners know about this. Maybe not all, but there's certain segments of society in Iran, and they can be quite easily classified, even though they're not entirely black and white structures. But the merchant class is the ones that have always really supported the ruling government because they were doing okay fiscally. But now a lot of these protests seem to be run by the merchants, who were the core supporters of the regime. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, and you're exactly right. The merchants were the first ones that basically shuttered their stores, and in protest to the high inflation rate. And you have to realize too, I mean, that's the high inflation rate comes as a consequence of the sanctions that have been put on Iran, and the fact that the Trump administration, as well as the EU, has upgraded their sanctions to where they're very, very strict, limiting. And so the consequence of that is that you have an economic crisis.
Yeah, I just wonder if because they're narrative masters in Iran. There's no denying it. They're narrative for the domestic audience. They're narrative masters, and I wonder if they're not necessarily the end game, but a path towards the end of this. And there are multiple ways this could go. Is to say that the reason you're struggling, the reason you're protesting, is because of the economic situation. The economic situation is directly attributable to the sanctions that the great Satan, the little Satan, and their cohorts in Europe have put on our country. They're strangling you. Now,
yeah, in fact,
just playing devil's advocate.
Yeah,
See, the way out of it, it's to stop being a murderous, terrorist-supporting group. Then the sanctions are gone. I get that, of course.
Right.
But please.
But and in fact, the narrative that is coming out of the mullahs is that this is not anything new. This is just an extension of the Israel-Iran war, and the fact that they consider the war to be continuing. It didn't end after the 12 days in June.
Right. Yeah. It's such a strange situation. It's really not like anywhere else, I think. And tell me if I've got my analysis off here. But there's a very good piece by Tim Donner on the pages of LibertyNation.com, where he talks about the age of Iranians, and the vast majority of them are around 20s, 30s kind of age. So they weren't alive, aware of what Iran was before 1979, when the mullahs took over. And you have this situation where Iran was this jewel of the Middle East, and So it's not like, for example, Afghanistan. I'm sorry, I'm not explaining myself particularly well, but if you take Afghanistan, Afghanistan has always been a bit of a hellhole. There's been very few times in history when it was anything but, at least in modern history. But with Iran, it was once this beautiful, prosperous nation, a bastion of freedom in an otherwise quite repressive region. And so it could go back to just 40 years ago. Yeah, 40 years ago, 45 years ago, 46 years ago, without too much difficulty, because, there are still people alive there, and they're the older generations, of course, but they're the old generations who've lived under the Shah, who lived in relative prosperity and peace. And so it strikes me, it's an individual case, and it's not like anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the average age, according to Tim, as I read his article, is 32, and so that's fairly young, And the other thing is you're right. It was really a beautiful place. I visited there and stayed in a hotel, and I expected Sydney Greenstreet to suddenly appear before me. It was that kind of an ambiance that was really quite special, and so it could easly is a flip term, but it could go back to the way it was, and as long as you have a government that is of the people.
Yeah, that's the key ingredient to any successful society. Dave, we're going to be back with you after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.